Hello, everybody. My name is David Flaherty. I'm the head of Magellan Strategies. I want to thank all of you for attending our webinar today. We do public opinion research in Colorado and around public education. And I also want to introduce, obviously, our partner on this project, Erica Meltzer.
Yeah, hi, thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Erica Meltzer. I'm the bureau chief for Chalkbeat, Colorado. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit journalism organization in 8 states, including Colorado, focused on issues of equity in education. And you can find us at co.chalkbeat.org. And it was really great to partner with Magellan on this and get to ask voters some of the questions that we've been wanting to ask them.
Definitely. Before we begin, we would like everybody to understand that this project that we did, this survey research, there's no agenda. We paid for it ourselves. We have an honest interest in public education issues around Colorado. And Erica and I teamed up in our teams to ask some very interesting questions. If you find some of the results of this survey, we're not out to give anybody a black eye. We're not here to pump up any ideas in any way. We're literally just reporting on the opinion data that we reported on, that we measured. So please keep that in mind. The second thing, Eric and I are going to walk through this survey first in the slides. There's a lot of questions. You can download the entire survey at magellanstrategies.com in the blog section. And we're not going to cover every question today, but we brought out the ones that we think that are perhaps the most interesting between us. During the presentation, if you have an idea for a question, please use the Q&A section on the right-hand side to submit your question. We'll be answering questions after we're done walking through the presentation. So please submit them, and here we go. So let's get started. This survey was in the field from late April to early May. We interviewed 882 registered voters in the state of Colorado. The survey results are weighted to be representative of the voter registration population of Colorado, and the margin of error for the top line results is plus or minus 3.3%. So let's get to it. Local school district job approval, excuse me. Simply, do you approve or disapprove of the job your local school district is doing educating students? 40% approve, 42% disapprove. Evenly split, and 18% not having an opinion. In all honesty, in our experience, these numbers are a little bit low, but also not that surprising. As you may realize, about 35% of any area of Colorado may have a household where they have a student in the public school system, so they're more familiar with their school district, where about 60% do not. But overall, it's sort of an even balance. Erica, any comments?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I think we see people influenced both by their own experiences with their kids in the school or with maybe their friends or relatives, but also, by what they hear in the news and just sort of a general feeling that things are going well or going poorly in the classroom. And I think we certainly have seen school board politics more in the news in the last couple of years than before. So that's probably playing a role here as well.
Definitely. And as we move on to the next question, do you think the public schools in your area are headed in the right direction, or do you feel they are off on the wrong track? Only 28% said that they were headed in the right direction, and 44% believe that they were on the wrong track. Both of those measurements in our history of polling and asking this question are record highs, and that goes back about 5 years. The right direction is the lowest we've ever measured, and the wrong track is the highest we've ever measured that. Erica, do you want to speak to some of the demographics or the differences that we're seeing here? Or
yeah, let's actually go on to the verbatims, because I think those really inform
absolutely. What's really going on here. We did a follow-up question among the folks that said they were on the right track. We asked them, please describe the reasons why you do feel like your school district is heading in the right direction. A lot of these are from parents. They feel that they're familiar with their teachers and they're very happy with them. They feel that it has a quality staff. Other supporters, they feel that the school district is doing the best they can in the days of COVID, as well as with limited resources. Or folks really appreciate how the district has handled COVID. That is also going in here as well. Any follow-up or comments, Erica?
Yeah, I think Colorado is a politically diverse state, and you'll see that, for example, people will say that schools, had COVID restrictions in place and did things to keep students safe, and that's a reason in one part of the state that people will say schools are on the right track. And then here we have a comment saying no mask, no CRT from a Republican parent. And so I think those political differences and those different policies throughout the state, um, to some degree, may actually mitigate or counteract some of the larger political trends, because people are in communities where the schools reflect their values.
And then more importantly, why do we have such a high level that are people saying that they're off on the wrong track? And you really have two things going on here. Historically, supporters of public schools tend to be Democrats, and they usually feel that a school may be on the wrong track because of either a lack of funding. They, more than any political affiliation in the state of Colorado, strongly believe that public education in Colorado is underfunded and they need more money. But it's kind of a double whammy because a lot of those folks also feel that schools are on the wrong track because of political agendas, conservative folks, becoming and being elected to these school boards and trying to impart upon them, their own personal ideological values. So they're very upset and frustrated with that. And at the same time, a lot of Republicans, many of them believe that critical race theory or sex education or gender identification is being taught in their school system. And so that's why they feel it's on the wrong track. And go ahead, Erica, and follow up.
Yeah, I think, we've talked a lot about the nationalization of local politics, where issues that are really prominent in the national news are influencing how people feel about local government. And I think we see that in these responses. Something that's been interesting to me, and we'll see this as we go throughout the slides, that often parents actually have a more positive, who have the most contact with the system, often have a more positive view than the electorate at large. And obviously both parents and voters are constituencies of school districts and school boards and policymakers. And so this is sort of an interesting tension there. I think it is concerning that we see such a broad wrong track feeling. Public education is really foundational to our democracy. And so it's important for people to feel committed to making it work. And I think it would be a really unfortunate development if there was sort of this widespread throwing up of hands at the problems, however much people may disagree. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say, just picking up on what Dave said at the top of the call, that we didn't approach this with an agenda. Some of these questions, and you'll see this in the verbatims, and you'll see this in some of the other slides, touch on issues of values and how you feel that kids should be treated in your school, or how you feel that it's the best way to teach certain topics. And what might look like crazy liberal sex education to one person might look like treating kids with respect and giving them the information they need to another person. And so these responses sort of reflect the political environment that we're operating in. And I think it's good to have open eyes about that, but nothing here, I think, should be taken to tell you this is how you should teach, or this is how you should handle this topic in your schools. Like, those are issues that I know that every educator here, would want to do what they think is best for kids. And I guess, like, the one positive note I want to call out here is we did see people across the political spectrum. They want kids to be reading well. They want them to have strong math skills. They want them to be critical thinkers. They want them to be prepared for 21st century jobs, which I think so those core values are still really widely shared despite the really intense polarization.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on. We had several questions measuring and understanding how Coloradans think education is funded. One was an open-ended. Please describe how you think public education is funded in Colorado. And we asked this question without posing options, like, you tell us how you think it's funded. And for the most part, people do understand that it is through taxes. Some understand perhaps it's more property tax. But we were also very curious to see, either to distill the myth or not, that so many people believe marijuana taxes are significant and they should be flowing to every school district. Therefore, why are you asking me for a property tax increase? Marijuana should be taking care of everything. And we wanted to see if that really was in there. And, really what we found is that, references to marijuana taxes funding schools wasn't overwhelming. It was less than 10% of the responses. There was some smatterings of it in there, but it is not at all overwhelming. Erica, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, there was another question that asked, like, can you pay teacher salaries out of marijuana sales tax? And there was not a majority, but there was a larger share of people that thought the answer to that was yes. And so I think there is still some room for education of voters on that issue, but it was not as high as I think maybe the conventional wisdom is, that everyone thinks that schools are just because I see these comments on social media. People post them on our page. Why should I vote for this? Because schools have all this pot tax money. But I don't think that's actually as widely believed as maybe a lot of us thought.
Definitely. And it doesn't hurt for a school district, perhaps, if they are in the middle of a ballot measure, to mention, hey, just so you know, we get very little funding from marijuana, and of making that clear. But it's definitely not perhaps as high as we thought it was going to be. Other general questions. Do you think school districts in Colorado have the financial resources needed to provide students with a good education? 43% said yes, 49% said no. But what, I think Eric and I found really interesting was among parents, the folks that are most familiar with their school district, a majority said yes, they do have enough funding to provide a good job. They obviously are closer to it more than anywhere. Non-parents, that's 65%, and that's either young adults or it's empty nesters. A majority felt that no, they don't. So we found that as really one very interesting observation. And Erica, you want to follow on that?
Yeah, that surprised me. I don't know that I have a lot of insight into why that is. Maybe for those of you running schools, you're doing a good job kind of filling in those gaps so that they're not as visible to parents. So good job. Yeah, obviously we see the partisan divide here. I don't think that's super surprising. But I guess that, if you're like, so yeah, just if you're trying to make a case around money for your community, just to keep in mind sort of how you're communicating that and who you're communicating to.
Yeah. Next question. Do you think additional funding for public education will result in a better education? A majority said yes on this question. If you really want to see, look at the partisan affiliation responses. Democratic folks, 85% overwhelmingly believe that this is true, where Republicans, a strong majority at 60%, do not. And then a slight majority of unaffiliates. I think that's very interesting and also not very surprising, as we have an ongoing, constant discussion in our state, regarding will more money lead to a better education? And a majority do believe that. But it's very interesting to see how that breaks out among these population subgroups.
No, I think you spoke to it.
Okay.
I think that's
sure. Okay. This section we checked out and measured opinions around certain policies, if you will. And one of those, to start off, among the following challenges facing public schools in Colorado, please choose up to 3 that you think school districts should be addressing the most. These are the options that we provided. Top 3, attracting and retaining high quality teachers, preparing students for the workforce. That's the number one issue. We see that a lot also in some of our higher education polling, and increasing teacher pay. Student mental health coming in 4th there, if you will. Preparing students for college, addressing student learning loss from COVID. Erica, do you want to speak to that or any of these others?
Yeah, I thought this was interesting, partly for the divide in what the general public thinks is most important versus maybe where a lot of the policy discussion is happening. So on the one hand, I think teacher pay and teacher retention have been very much in the news. I think we've heard a lot about staffing shortages. District leaders have certainly made it really clear that was just a huge challenge this past school year. And so I think that's gotten through, and we see that rated really highly. I think it's interesting that preparing students for the workforce rates higher than preparing students for college. I think there's a broader understanding. I think there's concern that students are coming out of high school unprepared. And I think some of the debate around student debt has I think, raised questions about should everyone go to college, but people do want to make sure that kids are coming out of school prepared, regardless of which path they take. And then I thought it was interesting that learning loss rated lower. And then some of the issues that are giving our schools a lot of headaches, like declining enrollment and how does that affect your financial bottom line, is not really registering with the public. This poll was taken before the Uvalde shooting, but we see that safety of school buildings did not rate very high as a concern.
Right, and it would have likely have been higher had it been during Uvalde. So interesting measurements. And again, if you're looking for particular subgroups, because this is overall responses. But right now, that's what they think school districts should be addressing the most. Okay, another policy that was talked about a lot in the legislature. Some people believe that the learning loss among Colorado students due to remote learning and COVID justify giving tax dollars directly to parents to pay for tutoring, tuition at another school, or other educational needs. Do you agree or disagree with this viewpoint? Strong majority of 60% do not agree with this viewpoint, or disagree, excuse me. And only about a third of respondents felt that this is where they wanted to go. In all of our years polling, in all honesty, folks, whether it's around school choice, charter schools, or here in Colorado, this is pretty consistent from what we see. Voters, anytime you start talking about re-diverting dollars like this, in a very broad description, it's pretty much a majority always oppose it. They're uncomfortable with it, as you can see, including a majority of Republicans. So I just would say that this policy is really not well embraced and at all. Erica, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so I think, this is consistent with sort of a general lack of interest in vouchers that we see in Colorado that probably is related to the strong public school choice system that we have in part. And I was curious if the disrupted learning during the pandemic would change that calculation. There were various bills that were run in the legislature. This was part of the Republican commitment to Colorado to give parents, put money in the pocket of parents so that they can address some of these learning needs. So I was curious if this was going to change due to the circumstances. And I was surprised to see sort of how consistent the opposition was across demographics. And
Sure.
this may also relate to to learning loss not being rated very highly as an issue, that maybe that's not resonating with people. And so there's not maybe the urgency that they would feel if they thought that learning loss was the top issue.
Definitely, and I would agree with that. I think this reinforces the impression that it's just not being discussed or reported on enough, if you will, or people are not aware of how do we address students and learning loss. Okay, another policy, voter opinion of standardized testing. We wanted to measure and understand, is there support for standardized student test scores primarily being the primary way to evaluate school and student performance? What we found is, would you prefer a broader set of criteria to evaluate school performance, or do you want to keep it to standardized student test scores? And overwhelmingly, 70% of people would prefer a broader set of standards. And I think this sets up well where, Colorado voters are ready to listen and learn. What ideas do you have for better evaluation? I think the time is really right for perhaps introducing some of those ideas from professional educators, in our state. So, Eric.
Yeah, I think we're going to be having this conversation. There, as noted on the earlier slide, there's an audit of the state accountability system. I think we're going to see some people really fighting to preserve what they see as objective measures of student achievement, and that's a really important factor to have in our system. And you're going to see a lot of people arguing that that's not the best way to do it. But of course, the big question is, okay, then what? What do you do? And there are a number of school districts that are doing experiments in that still have objectivity and quality control in how they measure it, but take in a broader set of factors. And so it'll be just interesting to see if that gets any traction.
Definitely. Okay. This was another interesting question. Erica, dropped this one in. I thought it was interesting, and it was really trying to answer the question: do COVID policies of candidates for school boards, are they still relevant? Do they still matter? Is that the primary way perhaps a candidate's going to be evaluated? Because it was such a big deal, obviously, in the elections of back in 2021. Feel free to speak to this, Erica. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it was pretty evenly divided, and yeah, I was curious. We have State Board of Education elections where I think some of the candidates are going to want to talk about COVID response and whether, how you balanced student needs and safety, and or whether those things were in conflict. I think we may see ongoing discussion as the pandemic waxes and wanes. In one sense, people were evenly divided. It didn't give me maybe the strong takeaway that I was hoping for. I did think it was a little interesting. I want to make sure I state this correctly. Democrats were more likely to say that it would still matter to them, and Republicans were more likely to say that it was less important. And that was maybe the opposite of what I was expecting, because we did see a lot of, we saw more backlash to COVID restrictions in Republican-leaning suburban areas. But we'll just have to see to what extent this comes up or doesn't in the future.
Yeah, and again, hopefully we don't have another outbreak, if you will, or a really strong surge of another variant this fall and going into the winter. But at the end of the day, we're not that surprised to see among Democratic voters 56% saying it is still important. And Democratic voters are put public health and safety. It's a much higher priority for them. Where I think Republican voters are really more interested in saying, "Hey, keep the schools open. There's no reason to shut down and put the brakes on everything." So, but as Erica said, we'll see where we go in the fall. Trust in public groups and organization regarding public education. And again, this is about trust. Please indicate how much trust you have in the following groups to address public education in Colorado: a lot, some, a little bit, or do not trust at all. And so that blue bar is for that organization, a lot and some trust combined. And the orange bar is that, really the no trust at all. Starting to the top, to my surprise, teachers unions, a lot of some trust combined. I'm not saying when we usually poll a local teacher union that they poor poorly or their image rating is not very good. Typically, teachers themselves poll higher than the unions. That's very common knowledge, I believe, for people that follow education. But in this instance, they registered 51% and 35% said there's no trust at all. Just some other observations. I would point out that both Democrats and Republicans are both upside down. A plurality had no trust in either of those parties compared to the percentage that had a lot or some trust combined. So that's important to see. I thought it was interesting that the Democrat no trust at all number was higher, because traditionally Democrats do, when you ask, which party do you feel has would you trust more on the issue of public education, et cetera, Democrats have historically done better, but not in this poll necessarily. So,
yeah, I think this is just an interest. I was surprised by this because, in light of all the wrong track responses and the amount of, I think it's fair to say, vitriol directed at teachers unions around COVID restrictions in school, I was just surprised to see that number so high. And yeah, on the demo, and no, I think Dave mostly covered it here. I think it's interesting that the Democrats and the Republicans both have relatively low trust and pretty close to each other, but you see the Democrats with a slightly higher distrust level, if more trust and more distrust. So I guess more people had opinions about Democrats.
Yeah. Okay. Charter schools and district-run schools, obviously, a lot of our discussions in the education community. So of course, we had to ask, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of charter schools? 52%, a majority, no surprise there. That's very consistent. We usually see them in a mid-50s range. 30% unfavorable. Party affiliation, obviously, I think most people know Republicans are big supporters of charter schools. Democrats not as much, but a plurality of unaffiliated voters do. But also, I point out, look at the parent versus non-parent breakout there. Parents absolutely support them, 2/3, 65%. Where non-parent support is not as strong. A plurality do have a favorable opinion of them, but nowhere near as high as the parents. So clearly, I feel that this wasn't as much of a surprise, and it was relatively in line, I think, with other public education surveys. Erica?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen questions around charter school policy be dominant issues in local school board elections. Particularly, I'm in Denver, so it's certainly been an issue in Denver school board elections, and we're starting to see more divide among Democrats at. I would say at the legislature, we still see very strong support for charter schools among most Democrats, but it is an issue that divides Democrats, and it's an issue that we see in national polling also divides Democrats. And there is a racial divide in that white Democrats tend to be more opposed to charter schools, and Black and Latino Democrats tend to have more favorable views. As a parent myself, one of my gut here is I think a lot of parents just feel like they like having choices for their kids, as opposed to approaching it from a really ideological perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we had an open-ended here. Please explain the differences between a charter schools and district-run schools. I really encourage everybody to look at this. I found these responses absolutely fascinating. Do you understand the difference? And I felt that a lot of the themes that evolve, like if you have a favorable opinion of charter schools, you're going to tout the positives, freedom of curriculum, higher student achievement. It's better managed than district-run schools, teaching to the student. Like they just felt it was great. If you have an unfavorable opinion of charters, though, they're not inclusive. They can turn away students. There's no diversity, and it's a biased curriculum. It's either very narrow, teaching, something. And some of those comments got pretty harsh in there. I'm gonna be very honest. People really do feel strongly about it one way or the other. But I was also pleasantly surprised. Many of the responses, people were on the mark of explaining what a charter school is and how it is run differently than a district-run school. So people were pretty knowledgeable about it, even among those non-parents. Erica?
Yeah, I felt like a majority of these responses were basically accurate. That people had an understanding of sort of where they fit in terms of regulatory environment, flexibility. There were still, interestingly, even some people who had favorable opinions of charter schools described them as private or semi-private. So for people who would like charter schools to be viewed as part of the public school family, probably still some work to do on that messaging. Yeah. But I think the other thing that's reflected here is there really is like an enormous diversity of charter schools, and there's places where you'll see the sort of classical curriculum. For people who really want that kind of back to basics approach, that they can find charter schools that will support that. And you also have progressive Montessori charter schools. And, and I feel like, even you can find charter schools, like some of the highest performing schools in the state with the highest test scores are charter schools. And you also find charter schools that are really, not doing very well. That sort of that flexibility and autonomy then produces a lot of diversity of results. And we do see that the charter sector continues to enroll a lower percentage of students with disabilities. That's not true of every single school. There are some schools that are doing a really good job at that, but across the state, on average, they still enroll a lower percentage of students with disabilities. And so even in some of those critical comments, I think there's, some truth to that for people to work on. And I know there's people in the charter sector working to improve that, very actively.
Yeah. Okay. Please indicate if you think the following statement is true or false. Most charter schools in Colorado are funded by their local school district. 40% thought that was true. 29% did not, and 31% didn't have an opinion. Erica, do you want to speak to that? Or?
No, I think it kind of speaks for itself. I mean, part of the reason this is in here, and we'll see this in the next couple slides, is some of this issue of do charter schools like take resources from public schools?
Sure. And yeah, we'll move on to the next slide there. Some people say charter schools weaken district-run schools by diverting students and funding. Do you agree or disagree with this viewpoint? And as you can see, the folks that do agree with this, not surprising to us, is Democratic responses. And those that vehemently disagree, that is obviously Republicans. They don't, agree there. Where unaffiliates, it's really kind of just breaking even. 39 agree, 41 disagree, 20% do not have an opinion. I think it was interesting among parents here, 57% disagreeing. Clearly, again, I think that's a testament to the belief in charter schools, without question, and among parents that obviously whether they have a student in a charter school or not, think obviously this statement perhaps does go too far, and they disagree with that. Where non-parents, it's a little bit more balanced. So.
Yeah, and this issue is really coming to a head in our districts with declining enrollment, where they're facing these really gut-wrenching decisions about closing schools. And there's sort of this question of what's the right number of schools to have in a district. And, people, some boards, they don't want to approve new charter schools, or they're wondering, why should we have to close our district-run schools, but not even consider the charter schools in the mix? And the reasons, because there's differences in state law, and we have seen charter schools also close due to low enrollment. But I think there's this issue of how do you manage all the things you have to manage as a district versus someone who's thinking this particular school would be good for some kids, therefore it should exist, and kind of the tension between those two needs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question. Do you support or oppose a policy that allows the state to intervene in low-performing school districts and have the legal right to close schools or convert them to charter schools? 44% supported this, 40% opposed this idea. So it's, again, very split down the middle here.
Yeah, and for those of you who are familiar with the school accountability system, this goes back to that question about should we be judging schools primarily based on test scores or other factors. State law does give the state the ability to intervene when performance doesn't improve and take some of these more significant steps. Mostly that has not happened. Mostly the state board has approved, signed off on improvement plans that districts have brought to them. Yeah, I mean, I think the partisan divide here is, I think, what we would expect. And I think this would be like a tough decision for anyone to sort of override that local control and take those steps. And so I'm not surprised that voters are divided and that we have a significant unknown, unsure.
Sure.
As well. I might be unsure if I was on the state board.
All right, some public education ballot measures. We included some questions in here in general regarding public education, because of TABOR. Many school districts, go to the voters for all sorts of funding. First and foremost, would you vote for a modest property tax increase to fund raising teachers' salaries for your school district? 57%. Democrats come in at 86% supporting on this. Republicans would not, at 2/3. But a majority of unaffiliated voters were. I think this correlates very well with what we know. If you ask somebody, how can we improve our public schools without telling them anything? Teacher pay, more qualified teachers is top of the mind for a good amount. Any other comments on this, Erica? Yeah.
No, I think this one speaks for itself, and as you said, reflects those priorities that voters identified.
Yeah. Now, the other side of the coin, how about a property tax increase to fund school building maintenance and improvements, which we see a lot of. And as you can see, support drops where it's really kind of split down the middle, 45 yes, 46 no. Surprising of, how strong the Republican opposition was to this regarding, school building and construction and so forth, and how Democrats overwhelmingly support it. But again, we're just trying to demonstrate here in asking these questions of the challenges of the different types of funding that school districts need. So.
Yeah, I thought the difference here was interesting, and this may look different in different communities. If you're able to make a really strong, if you're able to like show people our ceiling is falling down and our, we can't keep the food at safe temperatures in the cafeteria, and all those kinds of things. Certainly many districts have been able to make that case to their voters, but I thought it was pretty notable how much better the teacher salary polled than building maintenance.
Yep. Now, another general question, and we're just going to touch on this a little bit more. As we all know, we've had statewide ballot measures for a long time here in Colorado to increase funding for public education. And on this one, we kind of drew out, when considering a statewide ballot measure, are you more likely to vote for a ballot measure that requires funds to be spent on a specific education need, like recruiting and retaining teachers? Or are you more likely to vote for a ballot measure that lets the school district decide how the funding would be spent, kind of a local control thing? And as you can see, this didn't surprise us very much because we do a lot of ballot measure surveys, is that, they want specifics. They want the money to go directly towards something, and support wanes for these ballot measures when it's sort of we'll give you money and then, let the school districts decide. Now, I'm not saying that they don't trust the school district because, they're not going to do a good job with the money. It's just voters in all areas. And this is even outside the public education area for like local government or a special district, such as a fire district, a recreation district, or a library district under TABOR in Colorado. Voters like details and they like the money, kind of single subject. It's going to go to this rather than, heaven forbid, it's going to go to something that they may not support. So this didn't surprise us that much. Clearly, specifics are helpful when putting together or crafting a ballot measure for, whatever funding need. So.
Yeah, I think when we see the difference where many school districts are successful in passing mill levy overrides or bond measures versus, whereas at the state level, there's, I mean, I'm just going to say, there's been failure after failure to pass statewide ballot measures. And what we generally hear is that voters have a big concern with these statewide measures, that the money's not going to go where they think it's going to. And partly that's a distrust of state government, whereas they feel like in their local government, there's that closer touch. They can see the need. And I think they also feel like they can hold those local boards accountable. And so in that sense, I think it's not surprising that we would see more interest in something that went to a specific need. But I just think given how much partisan divide and polarization we saw in so many other responses, I think it was also interesting, like how uniform and consistent this was.
This is another question that we asked that was a little bit more relevant where some ballot measures we're working through. Would you support or oppose a statewide ballot measure to fund public education that would keep a portion of future TABOR refunds? 41 would support, 30% would oppose. Here, not much of a difference between the Democrat and Republican divide here, I think. But again, this is, I think everybody knows for the next 2 years, it's anticipated or forecast that we will have TABOR refunds will go out. So this is sort of a relevant question. I'll just leave it at that. Erica, you got?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it.
Yeah. Okay. This is an important question. Do you think your local school district manages its financial resources efficiently and spends taxpayer money wisely? This is a question we ask on all of our ballot measures. And this is, I know public educators and their communications teams have a lot on their plate, just communicating with parents and, the folks that they're really serving, what they're up to and what they're doing in that communication. But that other 65%, how often do you hear a story about how well your local school district or school did a great job of, on that mill levy and on that construction project where they came in under, budget, or just some good story about that. And this 31% low is kind of alarming, that only 31% saying that they think they spend taxpayer money wisely. These numbers need to be improved for individual school districts, especially ones that know they're likely to need to go to the ballot soon. So I just think that this is something that, there's a high 27%. I really don't know. I don't have an opinion. I'm not sure about that. But the perception obviously is either I'm uninformed or I would assume that it does not. And it's just something I just think for public educators and school districts to keep in mind as they go about, their plans.
Yeah, I think you mostly covered it. This is almost the opposite of the previous one, where even Democrats don't give a very high positive response here. Even though they do think that more money would make a difference and are often very willing to vote for tax increases. But there is that skepticism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, tested a couple of statewide ballot measures that were in the works. We thought this one was the most interesting. Voter opinion on to reallocate tax revenue to public education. And we believe this campaign's still in the works. Isn't that right, Erica? Or that...
Yeah, the deadline is August 8th to turn in signatures, and I believe they're still, I believe that they're working on that. So we'll see if they cross the threshold.
Personally, I think this proposal's genius compared to all the other ones that have gone through the ringer over the years of just allocating just 0.33% of annual revenue to the state towards the education account, if you will. It raises a significant amount of money, up close to $1 billion. It doesn't raise taxes, and it would be shielded from TABOR. And the respondents really supported this. I think a big reason why is, one, it doesn't raise their taxes. Now, two, even though It doesn't have those specifics that we talked about earlier of where the money would go. It's just sort of a big lift. And I think what's very clever about this ballot measure is that it's such a small amount of the overall general fund, and it's going to raise such a large amount. That's how I interpret it. And again, you have a majority of Republicans being for this. So I thought that was very telling.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. This is how people are responding to it before, it's not on the ballot. And if it gets on the ballot, we will see a no campaign that will make arguments that, for example, that it's going to reduce your TABOR refund, which we saw didn't pull well. Mm-hmm. But I thought this was pretty notable given the struggles that the folks who would like to pass a funding measure. I thought this was pretty notable support given the struggles that we've had in the past.
Definitely. So with that, that's our presentation. And if you have some questions, I know we've had some questions coming in. Just some basic ones. We had one question, I missed the start, how many people completed this survey. We had a total of 882 folks respond to this survey. It was statewide here in Colorado. That's just some basic questions. One question, can public schools have any effect on housing affordability? Teacher salary, the burden of housing are big issues in Colorado. I wouldn't necessarily, I know that's not exactly a question related to our presentation and the questions that we asked here, but obviously everybody understands good schools and highly rated schools are correlated to home values either being maintained or being strong. So I don't exactly have an exact question for that. Erica?
Yeah, we are seeing some, particularly in some of the mountain resort communities, we're seeing school districts invest in housing for their workforce. And I think that's, speaking to your point, that's an acknowledgement that the market is not going to necessarily solve this problem for school districts in these really expensive communities. That's a really thorny problem because I think it would be challenging to raise teacher salaries enough to address the rising cost of housing, which has just been astronomical in a lot of our Front Range communities. But if there is the expectation that this is a good middle class job, that you can afford a good middle class lifestyle, I think that does present a challenge.
Mm-hmm. And again, folks, just feel free to submit your question into the Q&A, in the chat. We're happy to answer your questions. One question, did the respondent pool match a likely statewide expected voter demographic? Again, just yes, it was matched to the demographics of the registered voter population in Colorado, just to answer your question. Another question, did you consider asking a question regarding if schools would improve if they had to compete for students? Also, what % of respondents own their own home? To answer your first question, no, we did not consider a question regarding the idea of schools competing for students in that sort of environment. And the percentage that are homeowners, I believe we have that demographic. I am not 100% sure. I'm not sure if we asked whether somebody rented or owned their home. So I apologize for that. One question I have for you, Erica, what was the most surprising finding for you in the survey?
I think, I did expect to see a partisan divide on many of these questions, but I think the strength of the wrong track feeling was surprising. And I think particularly when we looked at the verbatims, the types of things that people were saying surprised me in terms of, what I think of both as a journalist and as a parent, what I think of as the most significant issues in schools that there were certain other issues coming in. And that's partly why I referred to the sort of national issues coming in. That was a bit of a surprise to me. Maybe it shouldn't have been, but it was.
Sure. I mean, I would follow up on that. I agree. I was surprised how low things were. Obviously, school board elections have become, of interest to both political parties, especially with the Republican Party in 2021. And I also just think there's a lot of talk in, conservative media outlets about critical race theory. sex education, and giving the impression that this is being practiced, and whether you know it or not, in your local school district. And that in itself, I think, has really alarmed a lot of folks in the sense, especially more Democratic leaning voters that feel that they're underfunded, they're doing the best they can, and now on top of it all, whether you go back to almost like the Jeffco recall, you know what I mean, where changing curriculum, in a manner that perhaps doesn't give all views. It's really hot stuff. I mean, I encourage everybody to read these verbatims. There's a lot of emotion in there, and it's really getting caught up in the current political environment. And it's just, we've never measured that kind of attention and frustration within public education, other than your typical sort of debates over, charter schools and things like that. So
I think the other things that were notable to me is I feel like the thing that's been very dominant from my view is the pandemic had this enormous disruptive effect. Even though teachers tried really hard in many cases, like kids didn't get the same educational experience that they would have gotten if this had not happened. But that doesn't seem to be registering as much with voters. If you did a parent only survey, maybe it would look different, but it doesn't seem to be registering to the degree that it feels like a really pressing issue to me. So that was interesting. And then I think because we have seen the support for charter schools maintained in the legislature, even though under Democratic control, I feel like there's a bit of a divide there between the Democratic electorate and Democratic policymakers. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that will change at all, because I think when if someone identifies as a Democratic voter and feels like Democrats support public education, they're going to continue to vote. I don't know that they would not vote for someone because of a vote on one bill that was, favorable to charter schools, but it was just an interesting divide.
Definitely. Another question. Thank you for this presentation. I assume this survey was before the recent Supreme Court decision regarding religion on football fields and ultimately in schools. That's correct. That this was done in the late April and early May, so we did not. And just a question, we do this type of survey annually or possibly more frequently. I would think we would. Understand we paid for this out of our own pocket here, so we unfortunately are not going to be able to do it on a quarterly basis. But I'm sure that Eric and I, looking forward to the next time we do go into the field, we'll maintain some questions to measure changes of opinion on some of these questions. And we would very well consider questions regarding topics of interest, such as that. And then another question, curious if you considered telling how much is spent on average per child, and if they got a voucher for that amount of money, if parents thought you could get a better education. No, we did not. Understand something. At the very top of this, we said we do not have an agenda here, okay? We are interested in measuring opinions around charter schools and so forth. But there's other firms and groups in Colorado that do extensive polling around charter schools, and I encourage you to seek them out. There's no shortage of them asking those kinds of questions. Our focus here was really more about covering a wide array of issues around funding, ballot measures, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's other groups that have put out polls that they have publicized. In some cases, we've written about them at Chalkbeat, and I think, like with anything, we tried hard to ask these questions in as neutral a way as we could. But I think on any of these issues, if you ask the question differently, you'll also get you'll get different responses.
Sure. And again, we work really hard to try to ask, unbiased, very straightforward questions in measuring, because, it's just, we find the interest, it's very fascinating, and a good way to do a survey so that the education community in Colorado and the folks that really have an interest in it perhaps can use this research, for their own purposes. So, but with that, one final question here. Do you think the COVID effect isn't a broad worry because statewide test scores haven't been released? I'm not familiar with that, Erica.
Yeah, so students take the tests in the spring, but the results are not released until August, which those of you who work with this data in your professional lives, know the kind of issue that presents. It's been a complaint for a long time in terms of how actionable this is. So I think that is a possibility. We did see really concerning results out of the tests that were given in the spring of 2021. At the same time, participation was really low in those tests, and we gave a much reduced set of tests. And so it was really hard to do apples to oranges comparisons. But I think that anyone that works with that data was pretty concerned about what it showed. And we did try to report on that. But yeah, no, so we'll see what we see in August. And I think in some other, we actually have a story up on our site today, that's co.chalkbeat.org, about some interim results from the NWEA tests. And it does show that students are recovering some of those losses, but that they are still behind, worryingly behind where you would want them to be, and that the issues are actually greater for older students who have less time to make up the difference. So
thanks. No, great insight there. Folks, if there's no more questions, we're coming up on about an hour now. So we are recording this webinar. We will be posting it on our website for those of you that want to redistribute it. And I would also say to look at the survey results yourself. Please feel free to visit magellanstrategies.com. In our blog section, you'll see public education part 1, part 2, because we have so many questions. Okay, one final late question coming in. Have you considered polling teachers on the question of whether they think the schools in which they teach are on the right track? A comparison of themes found in the verbatim comments from the public and the teachers' perceptions would be interesting. I completely agree with you. The one challenge there is, though, I do not have a very solid database of teachers to try to invite to participate in a survey. But if we had something like that, it's something perhaps I think we would consider. But I also think a lot of teachers will participate in surveys where they know who is doing it and the questions that will be asked and so forth. So believe me, we're always open to ideas and thoughts. And, like last August, our firm did a parent-only survey, really more about measuring what they expected COVID, was going to be like heading into the schools. We may do something like that in the next couple months, but for right now, I just want to thank our partner in this, Chalkbeat, and Erica. Like, her insights were so helpful for us to really put together a research project that is perhaps more relevant to professional educators and folks in our state. So with that, thank you for coming and listening today, Erica.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you to Magellan for inviting us to participate in this, and thank you to those who attended. And